5 APUS History, Lesson 28, the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era falls into a long-standing series of American trends, cycles towards reform. In our country, think of it as being like a pendulum. We have cycles towards reform, followed by cycles towards reaction against reform, kind of counter-reform, if you will, going back against it, rolling back some of those things. If we'd seen the Gilded Age as an era of sort of an age of fantastic corruption, as we defined it in our earlier lessons, then it's time for a counter-movement against that. And the dawn of the 20th century brings us to that counter-movement towards reform against some of the excesses we've seen in corporate America during this time. And this will not be the last reforming theme we'll see. So as an AP History student, as an AP History writer and thinker, you should be aware of the fact that everything that's old is new again sometimes when it comes to reform and then pushbacks against reform. So this is simply one part of an ongoing cycle that we see. For our time period now, referencing the time period roughly around 1900 through around 1920 or so. Now, if I were to define progressive reform for you, the first thing I would say about it is that there is no one progressive reform. It's a whole series of reforms. It's a broad, overarching, all-encompassing series of movements. It's almost like if you took a can of paint, took a can of fresh paint, took the lid off, and turned the can upside down. And then where's the paint going to go? Once it hits the table, the paint's going to go everywhere. It's going to scatter randomly in all sorts of directions. Some directions will cross over and overlap. Some directions will go in completely opposite directions from other things. Many of these movements were very tangential. They were very self-contained and self-directed, and were interested in what they were focusing on, not this broader, bigger picture. So the progressive movement, to be clear, is not one overarching unified command structure dictating a wide range of reforms. It's a series of individual things taking place at the local, national, and federal, local, state, and federal level. Grassroots, some bottom up, some top down, and everything in between. Now, in terms of the earlier reform movements we'd seen attempts at reform during the Gilded Age that had failed. Attempts from the socialists and attempts from the populists, as you recall from your class and from earlier lessons. Well, the socialists had, in many ways, lined themselves up to destroy capitalism as part of their theory and belief that capitalism was immoral and wrong and the entire economic system had to be done away with. We'd seen this manifest itself most clearly through elements of the organized labor union. And the socialist movement is not going to get a great deal of traction in the United States. On the other hand, the populist movement did get some significant traction in the United States, even though it ultimately failed, as we'd seen from the 1880s and 1890s, to obtain the things they wanted regarding free silver, governmental reforms, unregulation of corporate America, reforms of the electoral process in terms of senators, initiative, referendum, recall. Populism achieved very little. The progressives, on the other hand, will achieve a great deal of what the populists wanted, but for different reasons. And I can't stress that enough, for different reasons. The progressives and populists were two very different sets of people, even though there wound up being sort of a realization of some of what the populists want by this different set. And to talk about this in a helpful sense, I think it would be instructive and useful for you to consider some of the contrasts there are between progressives and populists. First of all, we begin with our populists, who we'd seen in the 1880s, 1890s. Our populists, for their part, are rural in orientation. These would be the heirs to the legacy of the Jeffersonian yeoman, if you will. They were concerned with rural issues. They saw things in rural terms. As rural Americans, they're going to in many cases be of the lower economic classes and uneducated. That doesn't mean they're unintelligent. We're simply talking about the fact that they don't have a lot of access to schooling. Public schooling is going on, but it's sort of limited. There's limits to how far these people were rising in school in general. So they're not unintelligent. They're simply not having access to an awful lot of education, which makes it difficult in many ways for them to both do political battle in the United States and also articulate their points effectively to change minds on them. Populists were radical. They were angry. Because they were, I'll hop to the bottom for a moment, because they were emotionalists. They saw the world moving away from them in a way that didn't make sense for them, and it frustrated them. They felt cheated. They felt like they were not achieving what they were supposed to achieve in America. The system had somehow betrayed them. As such, they want radical change. They want to invert the order. They want the first to become last and the last to become first. They want to make the losers into winners in the American economic society and make the monopolists, the winners, somehow take them down several pegs, put them on lower rails as well. Because of their radicalism and because of their emotionalism that was driving their arguments, the populists achieved minimal gains. They didn't get a whole lot. They got some of the Granger laws, yes, some railroad regulation laws, yes, but very little beyond that. They certainly never got their 16-to-1 silver. The populists saw themselves as being on the outside looking in. As they saw the Gilded Age, they saw all this wealth, all this prosperity, a big prosperity party going on for the robber barons, for the monopolists. They saw themselves achieving none of that. All their hard work, the harder they worked, the more prices went down, the more the railroads charged them, the more the grain elevator people charged them, the more their manufacturers of equipment charged them, the less they got. They felt they were on the outside looking in. The progressives, for their part, the difference is stark in terms of who they are, and that explains everything. Who they are is going to explain their worldview. The progressives will be optimistic doers, and think about why. The progressives are urban-oriented. Okay, the progressives are city folk. And not just a city folk, they're middle-class city folk. In other words, they have access to education, they have a stake in the system. The American dream has sort of worked out for them, which is why they don't want to just tear it all down or blow it all up like the populists did. They're moderates. They have more modest goals. They say there's some things that are wrong about America, but there's an awful lot that's right about our capitalist system, our economy, our financial system, and the way that we live as a people. As a result, because of their moderation and because of the fact that they've got education and they've got their hands on some of the levers of power. They might not control everything, but as middle-class people that are invested in the system, they have access to some of the levers of power. They achieve positive gains. And my kids always say they want to answer this for me, and they say, oh, I know the next one. They're on the inside looking out. No. They're not on the inside looking out. They're on the inside looking around, okay? They're looking around at the world they live in. And what they see is that for them, the middle-class lifestyle, things have been good. But as they look around in this same world they inhabit, they see a lot of things that aren't right. They see poverty. They see people being limited on the basis of wealth and education. They see workplace conditions that are less than desirable. They see consumer product safety things that are in jeopardy. They see the environment problems that they think are necessary and are growing, or unnecessary and that are growing. They see problems for blacks, African Americans, problems for women. They see problems for immigrants. They see problems for the working classes and working poor. So they look around, they say, this world I'm looking at, there's some things here that aren't so good. There's a lot that's good, there's a lot that's worth having, but there's some things that need to be changed. There's some stuff that needs to be made over. And the way they're going to make it over is they're going to be rationalists. They're going to use their education, use their knowledge, use data, and try to apply rationality and logic to solving the compelling problems of the day. So understand we got red and green here. The green is where we are now, and the green is going to be far more successful as we look at the things they're going to attempt to attain. So what led to progressivism? What were the sources of this progressive reform, this series of movements that's so overlapping? Well, first of all, you had industrialization. And as the progressives looked around, on the inside looking around, industrialization brought many great things to Americans. Standardized products, quality products, cheaper products, a lot of jobs for people, a lot of wealth for people. But it also brought unemployment and labor unrest. Industrialization brought wasteful use of natural resources. It brought abuses of corporate power. So as a source of reform, the Panic and Depression of 1893, the great economic downturn, it magnified the problems in these cities of poverty and disease and crime and corruption. And this came along with this urbanization in the cities and their problems of crime, disease, and corruption was also immigration. The homogeneity, the sameness that had made America up as the progressives, the middle class had seen it for so long, had gone away never to return. We are a nation now, not just of Native Americans, meaning, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Native Americans, but we're this nation of immigrants, of new people coming in, and our cultures were changing as a result. And so the traditional class alignments have sort of been upset. You've got this new managerial class, you've got immigrants in the cities who are working in semi-skilled and unskilled labor. And so the idea then, if you couple up the Depression of 1893 with these new immigrants coming in who are penniless and who are working hard and being exploited in many ways, the idea of the old Horatio Alger rags to riches story, I think you've heard about him in your courses, the rags to riches stories, the success story of America, was increasingly being seen as a myth. And so as such, the new middle class sought to apply new solutions to what they saw as being new problems. We never had massive corporate interests before. We never had massive urbanization before. We never had a national economy on this scale before, and this kind of resource exploitation, this kind of wealth before. New problems called for new solutions. So the new middle class was composed of these young professionals, and they were going to drive this movement. And driving it, they sought to do some key things. They wanted to use the government to protect the common good. They wanted to substitute public interest, what was good for the most, the greatest good for the greatest number, substitute public interest for self-interest. Not because we're just all going to give away everything we have, but saying that sometimes self-interest runs counter to what's good for the collective whole. And they said we need to recognize that. They wanted to apply the principles of the professions, science, medicine, education, law, business, and teaching, to all the problems of society. They were going to be driven by science and efficiency in the collection of data, then to use this data in a rational manner. And they believed that people could overcome problems, individually and collectively, if they applied themselves to it. This ties in very much with what we saw during the Second Great Awakening and all the reforms of the antebellum period. As I said, this cycle is spiraling forward through time, of the pendulum now swinging towards an age of reform after the Gilded Age. And being urban in residence and orientation, they were going to be in a position where they could see these problems and work on these problems. They argue, the new middle class argued, that the complete laissez-faire model, hands-off, no government supervision or regulation or restriction of economy and politics and policy in any way, was obsolete. They said it was from a different time, conditions had changed, new problems called for new solutions.